The fairies exist in a liminal space between two worlds, in the underworld and the world of light, in the supernatural and the temporal realms. They emerge from the earth to capture mortals and draw them behind the veil that separates these two worlds. In Songs of the Irish, Donal O'Sullivan looks at this subject in the song of Bhean Úd Thíos ar Bhróchan Strahan. He says, amongst the popular superstitions of the Irish, there is none more widespread or more firmly held than the belief in an order of magical beings called the Sluagh, who inhabit the prehistoric tumuli or knolls which abound in the country. The Irish word for this type of tumulus is lis, generally rendered as fort. Though the Sluagh are called fairies in English, the translation is not very opposite. The ordinary concept of a fairy is a diminutive, supernatural being, whereas the Sluagh have the same stature as mortals. Probably the most familiar of these folks is the banshee fairy woman, whose wails as she combs her hair portends death or calamity. The Sluagh often sally forth from their dwelling places, riding on the whirlwind, the she guithe, and one of their activities is the abduction of mortals into their fort, children for those of their number who are childless, handsome young men for husbands, healthy young women to be wives or nursing mothers. In place of a person abducted, a changeling may be left, a withered old man or woman, or a peevish, sickly child, as the circumstance may require. In the present song, a young married woman has been swept from her palfrey and taken into the fort to function as a foster mother. On the anniversary of that day, she's standing at the door of the fort, nursing the child she has been given, when she sees a woman standing on the bank of a stream close by. Under the guise of a lullaby sung to the baby, she informs the woman of her abduction, describes the interior of the fort, and asks for a message to be conveyed to her husband with a view to her rescue. The husband is to carry a wax candle, presumably one of those blessed by the Church at Candlemas as a protection against the powers of darkness. He's to bring a black-hafted knife, which according to tradition is the only weapon capable of prevailing against the Sluagh. A single stab from it was fatal, but a second stab rendered the first one harmless. The husband is to strike the leading horse as it emerges from the fort, whereupon his wife will be made free, and he's to gather the herb that grows at the entrance, for possession of this is a sure safeguard against recapture. Finally, he's urged to come on the following day, because once a mortal has been in the custody of the Sluagh for a year and a day, all possibility of release is at an end. In the song of Bhean Úd Thíos, we get a very interesting exploration of a dark and multifaceted part of the mind. The captured woman has fallen prey to something beyond her control, something unnatural, and so we're introduced to the embodied supernatural, the fairies. The fairies are in our midst but beyond our sight. They are the unknown danger of everyday, the hidden malice that may lie beneath a facade of innocence. The story is a salutary warning to be aware of the world and to be aware of our own naivety, but there's another perplexing and deeper message hinted at. The woman pleads with the washerwoman to deliver her from her bondage, but finishes with a dark hint that she might prefer her present predicament than the freedom that she expressly desires. For if her husband does not come, she says, they'll make me fairy queen forever. This unexpected pronouncement subverts our expectations and indicates that there are many more facets to this beneath the surface of the narrative. If we examine this with a different lens, on a psychological level, this seems to imply that we are trapped by our own dysfunction and that we grow to love our dysfunction and our delusions. But to express one thing and to act out another, to suppress the truth and act out what we know to be fault, is dysfunctional, it's destructive, it builds, and in the end it must be released. This phenomena is part of the human condition. This is why it appears in the mythological and in the folk narratives, such as in Bhean Úd Thíos. But the narrative of the individual hero in the tale is also a distillation of a wider phenomenon as it acts out on the social and the societal level. The crowd mind behaves as the individual mind does. The Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky takes this same phenomenon and analyses it in both contexts in his 1872 novel Devils. There's a term for this mass delusion that relies on reinforcing a false understanding of the world on the crowd mind. It's now termed mass formation psychosis. Dostoevsky portrayed this in his novel, and he plotted what the release of this repressed dysfunction could look like. He drew the inspiration for this book from his observations of the ideas that were occurring at the time in his Russia and becoming more prevalent in the intellectual society of Russia during his lifetime. It was an embrace of nihilism and an rejection of the old conceptual frameworks of meaning, which shaped people's senses of duty, loyalty, and their means of connection to one another in a social order. He thought that this nihilism was doing two things simultaneously. It was fragmenting the individual's connection to a shared story and a shared metaphysics, and at the same time this distressed society, distressed because its ontological moorings had been set adrift, is in search of a new metaphysical system which binds people together, because the binding of a community is the thing that gives it a sense of meaning. He proposed that this was forming a new type of crowd mind, and that the crowd mind was destructive. Classical writers also talk about this when they're describing the mob of Rome, which had its own idiosyncratic pathology. Dostoevsky's book depicts a narrative that really becomes prophetic. I'd like to look at the philosophical elements that he imbued in his story and his analysis of the problem. The following is an extract from Devils. Luke chapter 8, verses 32 to 37. And there was there one herd of many swine feeding on the mountain, and they besought him that he would suffer them to enter into them, and he suffered them. Then went the devils out of the man, and entered into the swine, and the herd ran violently down a steep place into the lake, and were choked. When they that fed them saw what was done, they fled, and went and told it in the city and in the country. Then they went out to see what was done, and came to Jesus, and found a man out of whom the devils were departed, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed, and in his right mind, and they were afraid. My friend, said Stepan Trofimovich in great excitement, savez-vous? That wonderful and extraordinary passage has been a stumbling block to me all my life. Dans ces livres, so much so that I remembered those verses from childhood. Now an idea has occurred to me, une comparaison. A great number of ideas keeps coming into my mind now. You see, that's exactly like our Russia. Those devils that came out of the sixth man and entered into the swine. They are all the sores, all the foul contagions, all the impurities, all the devils great and small, that have multiplied in that great invalid, our beloved Russia, in the course of ages and ages. Oui, c'est Russie qui jamais toujours. But a great idea and a great will encompass it from on high, as with that lunatic possessed of devils. And all those devils will come forth. All the impurity, all the rottenness that was putrefying on the surface, and they will beg of themselves to enter into swine. And indeed, maybe they have entered into them already. They are we and those, and Petruchia, and les autres avec lui, and I perhaps at the head of them. And we shall cast ourselves down, possessed and raving, from the rocks into the sea, and we shall all be drowned, and a good thing too, for that is all we are fit for. But the sick man will be healed, and will sit at the feet of Jesus, and all will look at him with astonishment. My dear, vous comprenez après? But now it excites me very, very much. Vous comprenez après? Nous comprenons ensemble. That monologue was issued by one of the characters in Dostoevsky's novel, a man named Stepan Trofimovich, who made this statement on his deathbed. Dostoevsky's Devils is set in this fictional provincial town in Russia in the late 19th century, and it follows the lives of a group of characters chiefly drawn from the upper social echelons of society, as they wrestle with contrasts in ideas and values. The book's chief thematic and dramatic focus is centred around the questioning of established order and morality, and a rejection of tradition and an embrace of nihilism. Through the characters and dialogues, we see new ontological worldviews are emerging to replace old metaphysics of religion and social traditions. Ideas of rationality and equality simmer into consciousness, and an intellectual vanguard drawn from the highest level of the old feudal social strata conspire to overthrow the social order, chiefly through a rejection of the social glue of traditional morality. The conspirators, led by a son of a noble family, Nikolai Stavrogin, deemed that to overthrow society they must undermine the moral framework that binds it, and thus cause a free-floating anxiety which will hasten its ruin. From the ruined world they will, they assume, be able to build a new society according to their vision. Dostoevsky said that the theme of this novel, which so ably depicts social dysfunction, was the very one over which, consciously and unconsciously, I have been tormented by all my life. It is the existence of God. This is an interesting dilemma even for an agnostic.
For in an agnostic sense, what is God other than a personification of a society's highest moral values? Dostoevsky draws a line from tradition to fate, saying that a man who loses his people and his national roots also loses the fate of its fathers and his God. We could reverse these suppositions and say that to lose fate is to unhitch your moorings from the rooted morality of transcendent truth, and that this dissolves all loyalties to country, culture, and humanity. Dostoevsky explores this nihilism in his character's moral emptiness, which has been replaced by sloganeering and resentful destructiveness, chiefly and most vehemently against tradition. Central to the story is the group of conspirators, a 5-man cell of a secret society, which is distributed throughout the country through anonymous networks. The secrecy of these networks, where members of each cell know only the other members of the cell and no other members of the society, contributes to a sense of free-floating anxiety and psychological discontent within the movement, which also leaches out into the wider society. This anxiety and sense of isolation paradoxically binds a member of the cell together in a unified purpose and leaves them in a sort of hypnotized state, where the direction of Stavrogan becomes a narrow focus of their search for meaning within a new kind of society. Stavrogan focuses their purpose on a significant but ultimately pointless task: to murder one of their co-conspirators. Stavrogan knows the power this unified purpose will give on the minds of his followers, and he professes to planning it chiefly as a means of keeping control of the group. So the group chooses this purge of one of their own members, chiefly as a mechanism to release some of that pent-up anxiety and aggression and give themselves a sense of common purpose. The nihilism that conspirators embrace infects all elements of their lives and their sense of being. The simplest form of human relations are twisted and corrupted by this metastasizing idea. Marriage is undertaken as a form of self-mortification. Motives are subdued and secret and compelled. Amongst the conspirators at the centre of the story, the nihilistic questioning of all, from authority to morality, has left man with only Epicurean sensation as an existential validation. Stavrogan's visit to the monk Tikhon, where he confesses to unspeakable manipulation of an innocent child, which he confesses to doing solely for the sensation of feeling something, provides a deep insight into this. Here he admits to abusing the child and watching her commit suicide, simply for the sensation that he expected to feel at his own crime. He cares not whether this sensation is pleasure or disgust. His rejection of tradition is also a hollowing of his humanity. It leaves him soulless. Stavrogan does this unspeakable thing so that he can feel disgust at himself. In his embrace of nihilism, he knows he has rejected good and clothes himself in the spirit and from communion with God and man. Another character, Shatov, the co-conspirator who is murdered at the instruction of Stavrogan, realizes the emptiness of Stavrogan's nihilism and turns back towards a hierarchical framework of objective and spiritual values which he finds in God. He realizes that it's impossible to live a meaningless existence without the pain of existence corrupting you beyond redemption. We know from Stavrogan's conversation with the monk Tikhon that he also realizes this, but there's a salient contrast in how Shatov acts on this realization and how Stavrogan does. Shatov accepts the transcendent, which is expressed as a love for humanity. We see this most strikingly in the birth of the child to Marie, a dramatic incident that bears striking redemptive resemblance to the Nativity of Christ. Marie is Shatov's estranged wife, and the child, ironically, is Stavrogan's. Stavrogan, on the other hand, seeks sensation in the pain of corruption, because the emptiness of nihilism is death to his spirit. His encounters with innocence and youth is a complete perversion. He corrupts an innocent child and pushes her to suicide. He does this in search of sensation, because the void in his soul leaves him feeling lifeless. His dead soul feels nothing. He even contemplates suicide, not out of despair, but merely so that he might feel the fear of death himself. This realization sheds light on his duel with the ridiculous Captain Lebyadkin, where he deliberately tries to lose to his opponents. As we learn of Shatov's character from his confession to Tikhon, this looks like an attempted suicide. Stavrogan's action during the duel, where he deliberately fires away from Lebyadkin on several of his turns, seems to be a manipulation of the situation, where he tries both to control the circumstances of his death while leaving it up to fate. The ridiculous and boastful Lebyadkin proves unable to execute even this simple feat of hitting a target at close range even, leaving Stavrogan frustrated. The dysfunction of Stavrogan's world the embrace of meaninglessness, is encapsulated in this scene. All of the main characters amongst the conspirators and their cohort were disconnected from the communal ties that comes with loyalty to a country or a place. Each had left home and wandered aimlessly across the globe, in a fruitless nihilistic search for a substitute to meaning. They find this, as many do, in a cause dedicated to a vision rather than humanity. All this had brought them was further alienation, so that each suffered in his own way, from a free form of floating anxiety and nihilistic despair. Into this anxious craving for purpose, the ideology and focus of Stravogrin acted as an hypnotic conduit. Dostoevsky's analysis of the psychopathology of his time was extraordinarily prescient. The psychodrama and the phenomena he describes in Devils is perfectly resonant of the intellectual momentum of his time, and all the main characters of this novel, interestingly, were based on real people that existed in the Russia of his time. But the prophetic prescience of the drama he created resonates with the retrospective analysis of the emergent phenomena of mass formation, which would have a history-shattering effect across the globe. He felt that the parable of the devil and the swine was a prophecy for the trajectory of his own dysfunctional society. Indeed, that it was so much part of the pathology of mankind that it always existed, and that it always exists. The French philosopher René Girard hypothesized that scapegoating was another mechanism of expunging this type of free-floating anxiety. He felt that this violent reaction of the social mind was a sort of release valve for a social dysfunction arising out of resentment, born of emetic desire. In 1895, 23 years after the publishing of Devils, the French polymath Charles-Marie Gustave Le Bon described this pathology in The Crowd, the Study of the Popular Mind. He predicted that a new kind of state would arise, where the group mind would take control of the political apparatus. This was exactly what happened in Bolshevik Russia and Italy and Germany over the next number of decades. Dostoevsky, for his part, saw it all coming. He said, "Communism will conquer one day, irrespective of whether the communists are right or wrong. But this triumph will stand very far from the kingdom of heaven. All the same, we must accept that this triumph will come one day, even though none of those who at present steer the world's fate have any idea about it at all." In filming this video of Bhean Úd Thíos, we went to the site of a 19th century eviction cottage, Belcara Eviction Cottage beside Cathlemar in County Mayo, a place of profound history and trauma. This cottage was restored to the state that it was in 1886, when a crowbar brigade smashed in the walls and tumbled the thatch and threw a family of 9 out on the road. Across the road from the cottage, a small shed that neighbours built for the destitute family still stands. A bare dry stone windowless shed, it measures about 20 feet by 10 feet. We took the theme and history of the song and place as an inspiration for the video, which was filmed by producer Terry McMahon. Concealment, suppression, and dysfunction. All of these themes are combined. It wasn't really planned. In fact, we had a different video planned for the day. But the place seemed to incite this film, and this subdued theme of dysfunction gushed forth. Bhean Úd Thíos rug an trán, Swine Digan tasa fama yaran, Swine It's
Sun couple tossy